I'd like to warmly welcome you all to our last OI public lecture series of the year 2025 on climate change and Atoll Islands. Do we dare to hope? I'm Professor Steve Swearer. I'm the Jock Clough Marine Foundation Oceans Chair. I've been at UWA now for a little over a year and a half, so still figuring my way around the institution. And so if you don't know who I am, that's who I am, and I'm going to be emceeing this event tonight. And before we go any further, I'd like to make an acknowledgement that we gather here tonight to pay our respects to the past and present traditional owners on the land on which our experts reside, the Whadjuk Noongar people of Western Australia, and to all the native peoples of the lands and seas on which our researchers work. A component of these public seminar lecture series are that we have a panel, and so we have a panel of distinguished experts with a broad range of interdisciplinary expertise to stimulate a discussion that will follow Jon's talk. So the way we do this too is I have a series of kind of canned questions that I'm going to ask the panel members, but we also want to solicit questions from you, the audience members. So if you can take a moment to, if you're interested in posting questions, you can scan that QR code, and we'll use that app. And we have some strategically placed individuals who will also try to upscore questions that are more warranted of being asked than other ones. So you can also, I think, vote for ones that already appear in the app. Okay, so we'll do that after Jon's talk. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Jon Barnett, who's also using a photo like I do that's probably about 15 to 20 years dated. And I think, Jon, you and I probably need to admit that we don't look like this anymore by a long shot. Jon is the co-director of the Oceania Institute at the University of Melbourne, and he is a political geographer whose research investigates social impacts and responses to environmental change. With more than 25 years of field research across Australia, China, Timor-Leste, and the Pacific, he has advanced understanding of climate impacts on culture, security, inequality, and migration. Jon is also a former ARC laureate professor, and I cannot remember the title, but he is involved also on the science advisory group of the Global Environment Facility for the UN. Without further ado, please welcome and join me in welcoming Jon Barnett.
Thank you, Steve. I'll begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Thanks to the Oceans Institute, and especially to Steve for the invitation, and thanks Steve for your very excellent and passionate research. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Thanks to Vivian for organising the event, and thank you all for coming, and well done on finding your way here. It's a very long walk. Let me start here. These are some pictures from the Marshall Islands and Kiribati. These are countries comprised only of low-lying atolls, and the figures are from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the World Meteorological Organisation. Take a minute to look at these images and think about how you feel. Think about how you felt about this kind of information in the past. How do you feel? Do you feel at different points in time we feel different things? Do you feel disbelief? Do you feel grief? Do you feel scepticism, pessimism, despair, intrigue, outrage, anxiety? Are you tired of this? Does it challenge you? Does it inspire you? Do you feel sympathy? Do you feel solidarity? Do you feel empowered or disempowered? Does anybody feel hopeful? There's no wrong emotions here, and I can tell you, I've been doing this for 25 years, I get all those emotions. Sometimes I get them in a day. But they're all responses in part to how we think and what we think we know about these places. And the thing about atolls is that they are absolute symbols and synonyms for the climate catastrophe. Whenever we hear about atolls and whenever we hear about climate change, we hear about Tuvalu or Kiribati or the Marshall Islands or these low-lying islands that are very vulnerable. So they are a really extreme case of climate vulnerability and climate impacts. And we think we know, and we think we understand what their future is going to be, and that is difficult. And I'm going to try and open up some space around what we think we know about these things. So what do we know about climate change in these places? What do we really know? How do we know that, and who produces that knowledge? What don't we know? What do local people know that Western science doesn't know? And if you knew things differently, would you feel differently? And if you felt differently about the future of these places under climate change, would you feel differently about the future under climate change in general? So that's us. I'm talking about us in this room. But it's also worth thinking about how the people who live in these islands feel when they get these stories, when the experts come through and when they read the media and when they're told that they have no future and that they may have to migrate. How do they feel? What do they themselves know? How much confidence do they have in their knowledge? How much confidence they have to challenge the knowledge that's given to them? They're talked about, they're not talked to. How does that shape how they act? And if they knew differently, would they act differently? So today I'm going to talk about the science of this, but I also want us to think about the meaning and the symbolism of that science as well. So I'm going to suggest to you there's a lot that we don't know about the future of these places under a changing climate. And what we do know certainly doesn't suggest there's going to be a good future. There are no great futures for people living on atolls. There is enough room for hoping that there are things that can be done should we act in a timely way. So that's my intention here. And as I said, atolls are an extreme problem. So if you're not particularly concerned about atolls, if it is the case that there might be hope in the future for atolls and you're very concerned about climate change, then thinking about the way that there might be hope and solutions for atolls may also mean that that is true more generally for climate change. I'll unpack this as we go. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the problem of climate change and the science, and then I'm going to talk about the problem of the way we represent climate change and the ideas about climate change. I won't go in too far into that sort of idea about ideas. I'm going to talk about why hope is important then and give you some reasons why there might be some hope for the future of atolls. So this is all based on this Australian Research Council project I had that started in 2019, which was a brilliantly designed project for COVID-19 to completely and absolutely destroy. This was working in 4 countries that were the first countries in the world to close down during COVID-19 and the last countries in the world to open up. Students were stranded travelling between their countries and Australia and were stuck in Fiji for years. The PhD students are still finishing. You couldn't really have designed a project to be more vulnerable to climate change than this. So it started like this and it's kind of ending a bit more like this. Also it's social science, so it always ends up looking like this anyway. Just to say that what I'm talking about is knowledge that's been produced by a team of postdoctoral researchers and PhD students, many from these atoll countries. So I feel a bit like I'm representing their work here, not just my own. Okay, so let's just talk a bit about the problem of climate change. I'm not going to go through the IPC standard stump talk about climate change on islands because it's quite boring and you can read about it, but there is a very important, overwhelming thing to say here. We are on a rate of change in the climate that's unprecedented in the history of human civilization. So this graph on the left here, your left here, came up and I think it was the IPCC 3rd assessment report or 4th assessment report, and it, to me, is the most important graph the IPCC has ever produced, and it's often overlooked. It basically shows humans began farming around 10,000 years ago. We settled into cities about 5,000 years ago, and as you can see from this graph, for that whole period of time, the climate was relatively stable. So everything we've done as a civilization, everything we've built, every crop that we've grown, we've built all our cities on deltas and estuaries because that was good for transport and access for water. Everything is now going to have to change because we're moving into a different climate. That's the task of climate change adaptation. It's not a trivial task. Now for atolls, people settled into atolls. Atolls have been around geologically for a very, very long time, but people only began moving into them about 3,000 years ago. So people settled in the Marshall Islands sort of 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. So they too have moved into these very marginal environments in a period where the climate was very stable and the climate is now significantly changing. So there are all sorts of challenges that this brings and all sorts of challenges to atolls, especially around water and food and so on. But for reasons I won't go into now, I think the water and food aspects are all relatively solvable one way or another, but the real problem for atolls that is common to all low-lying coasts, but for atolls, they are only all low-lying coast. There's nowhere for them to retreat to. The real problem is sea level rise. So make no mistake, it's very scary. If you live on an atoll, this is Namdrik Atoll in the Marshall Islands, this is a high flooding event. And people we've talked to say, you know, you can stand there in a high flooding event and you don't see land. All you see is a continuity of water from the ocean up to your knees and your ankles flying into the lagoon. It's very scary. But is it this scary? Is it the case that everybody's going to have to leave these islands because of climate change? And that's the question I'm concerned with. Not so much if climate change is going to be bad for people living on atolls. It's going to be bad for people living on atolls. We are imposing a burden, even in the best possible future, of work and of adaptation that's going to be required of these people. That is one that all societies bear, but they particularly have to bear. They have no responsibility for their emissions, and their capacity to adapt at the moment is quite low financially. So it's going to be bad. The question is, can people still live meaningful, dignified lives on atolls? Is there some hope for the future? Or will it be chaos, crisis, conflict, forced migration, and so on? So that's the science. That's the big picture. Now I want to say something about the story that we tell about the future of these places through the science. So the science assumes that climate change is going to undermine the ability of people to live on atolls. This is mostly big picture Earth system science. It's atmospheric modelling, talk about rising sea levels, and I'll go into some of the more nuanced evidence about the geomorphological and biological responses to those islands, but the stuff we get is this big picture stuff. IPCC, general circulation model, oceanic modelling stuff that assumes that islands are inert, sea levels are going to rise. It also assumes people can't do anything. I'm a social scientist, and social scientists are as guilty of producing these no-hope ideas as scientists are. We did because it was COVID, we had nothing to do. We did it like everybody else, a systematic review of all the social science papers written about climate change, adaptation and atolls. And only 10% of them were actually about adaptation in the sense of what you could do to live on these islands. Almost all those papers were about why nothing could possibly be done, because they're poor or because their populations are too small or because they don't have capability. And more than 21% of them were all about how migration is ultimately inevitable. So a lot of the research that's supposed to be about solutions is actually about barriers to adaptation, limits to adaptation, maladaptation or vulnerability. A lot of the research is about why there could not be a solution for these people. So researchers are chasing bad news here, and we're all guilty of this. And that's a problem. It's a problem because it stigmatises these islands. It's a problem because when we continually say there is no future for them and they cannot help themselves, that they are vulnerable, by definition, vulnerability means you are not able to control your situation. Indigenous people were vulnerable and we had to save them from themselves. Indigenous children were vulnerable and we had to take them away from their parents. We do the same thing when we talk about islands. We say they are vulnerable and they can't help themselves, and the same dynamics then happen. Experts have to save them. And that leads to a very strong, and I could give you many lectures about this, the way development agencies and development banks and the international system colonises the ideas and the process of adaptation on behalf of people in islands. Because everybody turns up saying they can't help themselves, we must help you, you are vulnerable. These ideas about forced migration imply giving up, and they're very handy for a whole range of people. It's very handy for big polluters to say there's nothing that can be done on atolls, therefore why would we reduce our emissions? There's nothing that can be done to help these people, so let's not even bother trying. 20 years ago, I had a conversation with a development agency saying there is no point putting desalinisation plants into atolls because they're not going to be there in 10 years' time. So this is the idea about bringing the future into the present. The idea about sustainability is that you manage things in perpetuity. Well, that idea doesn't apply to atolls anymore. Lots of people have these ideas that there's no point managing these places in perpetuity. And so if you don't put desalinisation plants into atolls, they have water problems tomorrow that could have been avoided had you put the desalinisation plant in. And people start to behave in all sorts of ways. There's interesting economic work about this, about how discounting the future and terminating ideas about the future changes behaviour in the present. If you're a social scientist, this is work called temporalities. I won't go into this more, but I will point out this study that I was very pleased to supervise, an excellent piece of research from Kari Gibson, who's a psychologist. So Kari did a double study in Tuvalu where she said, well, we first need to understand how Tuvaluans understand distress and mental health in terms of their languages and their understanding of behaviours. She did that work and tested that, and then she tried to find the signal of climate change on distress and people in Tuvalu. She found that in 87% of the population she dealt with, there was a level of distress that we would say is clinically significant in that it impairs people's ability to do daily tasks. Very importantly, she found that of those people who experienced climate change distress, there were two signals. One was their experience of climate change impact. So terrible things have happened in Tuvalu. Storms have come through, washed away graves, people have had to wade into the ocean to retrieve the bodies of their ancestors and things like that. But half of it is the messages that people hear about their future because of climate change. So the idea about climate change is responsible for clinically significant levels of distress in people in Tuvalu. What they hear about their future is impacting upon their behaviour and the way they feel about things. And we know that high levels of anxiety and distress, and we know this from research about climate anxiety, does not promote pro-environmental behaviours or adaptive behaviours. It isn't conducive to proactive action. So in telling people in atolls that they have no future, and telling them again and again and again without talking with them, the way science does and the way the media does, we are causing anxiety, we are impeding the adaptive response of individuals. The message is half the problem. The message is as much the problem as the physical materialisation of climate change. So the message becomes very important. This is why hope is important. So there's a range of research on climate change in the behavioural sciences that finds a number of things, but it is focusing increasingly on hope as an enabler of climate change. This research shows that when you scare people, that does not motivate action. What motivates behaviour is a level of salience and valence. You have to care about a problem, you have to know about a problem, and you have to know about solutions. Scaring the shit out of people does not make them, or high levels of anxiety does not create proactive, constructive forms of change, which decreases propensity of action. Hope, on the other hand, and giving people some form of hope, is positively associated with goal direction action on climate change. Hope also enhances well-being. So hope is an antidote to these high levels of climate anxiety. And you can hold hope and salience and valence at the same time. You can care about a thing, you can be worried about a thing, but also know that maybe we could do something about that thing. These things can coexist. We know also that there's a positive feedback between hope and adaptation. So we've done work in the Maldives. We see people in the Maldives, we've done a lot of comparative work in this project, really not very anxious about climate change, generally pretty positive about climate change because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on those islands all the time. They can touch adaptation, they can see the desalinisation plant, they can see the land reclamation, they can see all the things that are happening. They think that they can adapt their way out of this future. So successful adaptation has a positive feedback from hope. Hope has a positive effect on feeding adaptation. There's a positive cycle there that we think exists. I guess this is a theory with some evidence. Conversely, we know that if we create anxiety and people do not adapt and don't take adaptive action, they're more vulnerable to the next climate event, they become more anxious, and they go into a negative cycle. So hope is important as an enabler. Hope is desirable. So hope is a state in which one believes that something positive which doesn't presently apply to one's life could still materialise. It's a thing that we want, it's an emotion, and it's a cognition. It's a goal-directed energy, and importantly, it involves knowledge of pathways to meet goals. So this is the issue with atolls, is that the knowledge about how to adapt, and it's difficult knowledge, and it's a hard sell to say that adaptation is possible. That knowledge is not there. Part of my research is about trying to fill in that knowledge to say what could we do if we threw the kitchen sink at the challenge of adaptation in atolls to create pathways of ideas of action, the assembling of new practices and technologies and institutions and ways of doing things to enable people to adapt to climate change, because that brings hope. That's important anyway. Okay, so what might we say about what the future of atolls might be? Why might we be hopeful? So let me say three things about this. There's a lot of uncertainty about climate science, which I'm going to talk about. I'll talk a bit about what adaptation might do, and I'll say some things about the people themselves. So really, useful graphic I like from Ian Holman and Mark Runzeville that explains the problem of climate change and uncertainty in climate change research in general, and the reasons why uncertainty compounds down through. We understand that we're going to have present and future missions. Climate modelling shows that, but there's ranges of uncertainties in climate models. When we start taking general climate models down into regional environmental circumstances, we have even more uncertainty, and it cascades all the way down through to what adaptation might achieve. So by the time we get down here and we start to think about what the future of islands might be, there's a massive range of uncertainties built into the scientific production process. That means we don't know. So one of the things that I like to do, for example, and I do get into debates with people because selling the hope for the future of atolls is a bit of a hard sell, they say there's no way people are going to be living in atolls in the future. And I say, when? Tell me when. You don't know, do you? Why? Because it's uncertain. Why won't people be able to live in atolls? What's the pathway to impact? You tell me what the problem is and I'll tell you what the solution is. So there's all this uncertainty. There's uncertainty about future rates of warming. There's uncertainty about the response of reefs. There's uncertainty about the response of islands, and then there's uncertainty about what adaptation might achieve. So I'll talk about these in turn. This is about future rates of warming. So there's emissions baked into the system, no doubt about this. It's all very bad. But don't ignore the range of possible bads here. Nobody is saying anymore, and you can read the academic literature and you read the media stuff, this is the worst case scenario. This is the SSP 5.8.5 scenario. And what this line is for each of these scenarios, this is the most plausible emissions outcome, but there's ranges of uncertainty around the modelling. Nobody is saying this world is possible anymore. Even the world is in a bad place, but nobody's suggesting that we're going here. Basically, we are landing at the moment somewhere around about here. This is the Climate Action Tracker. And it basically says, if we look at things that are already baked into the system in terms of the energy transition that's going on, we're probably going to land at about 2.6 degrees of warming above pre-industrial by the end of the century, which is about this climate scenario. But there's uncertainty around that. We could get lucky and it might only be 2.1 degrees, or we could be unlucky or it might be 3.3 degrees. But countries have started to make pledges under the Paris Agreement, and those pledges are meant to be sort of incrementally improving over time. And if countries did what they said they were going to do, we might end up still around about here, but the range of uncertainty is less. Sorry, that's 2030 targets. If we go to their Paris pledges, it gets down here. If we're really, really lucky, we might end up down here at 1.9 degrees of warming with a range of uncertainty of 2.4 and 1.5 degrees. So at the moment, based on the evidence that we have about behaviours around emissions, this is the range, 3.3 to 1. Whatever that then is, so my glasses aren't that good, 1.5 degrees. But let's say we're here around this one. This is the sort of inevitable future and the range we're heading at, given what we already know, right? So that's SSP 2.45. SSP 2.5 gives you somewhere between 44 and 76 centimetres of sea level rise in Majorana Marshall Islands. Now, if you're 2 metres above sea level rise, the difference between 44 and 76 centimetres is actually pretty significant from an adaptation point of view. It's not just the volume of change that you have to adapt to, it's critically the speed of change. So it's how fast you have to change. And if it's 76 centimetres, you've got to adapt a lot quicker than if it's 44 centimetres. So this all stuff becomes very, very important. And the thing about these uncertainty estimates is this 3.3 and this 2.1 are both equally likely. 2.6 is the best possible outcome. So we could get lucky and it could be 2.1 degrees. If it's 2.1 degrees, that puts us down on maybe about a 1.26 scenario, and then we're talking about 32 to 62 centimetres. It's all still uncertain. The big variable here is how much we reduce our emissions. That's really important, and that is within our control. We're not doing a great job on it, but we are reducing our emissions, and if we had a set in 1992, every year that I've taught climate change to students, I've pulled out these IPCC scenarios. And every year I see that we are moving off the worst case scenario. So there's change. The question is how much change and how fast. And for atolls, that is a really critical question. But it is uncertain. The future of emissions is uncertain, and that really matters for atolls. So that's one area of uncertainty. The other thing we have to consider here is that atoll environments and atoll people are not passive. There's going to be change. It's going to be change for the worse, but there are other things going on here that we need to understand and that are still uncertain. So one is the uncertainty about the response of coral reefs themselves, the relationships between reef ecology, extreme sea levels, mean and short-term extreme sea levels, sea surface temperatures, and ocean uncertainty is still uncertain. It's all bad, but again, how bad and how bad when it will be is still uncertain. Not all reefs can grow with rising sea levels, but some are more capable than others. Reefs are clearly changing their structure and function in response to existing conditions. Small, softer corals are dying, bigger brain corals and harder corals are becoming to dominate, but they're the things that build islands, actually. Islands are built, or the people live on these islands through storms, which deposit material. So it's meant to be storms that deposit material, and that's what people live on. So actually, in a world where there's more coral debris and more storms, actually for a period of time, islands will be built more. In the long term, who knows what the outcome of that is. We know that there's coral mortality, but not to the same degree in all reefs. There's a whole lot of things that humans do that makes reefs more vulnerable, and so we can reduce our impact on reefs, and that would improve their resilience. We're not sure about the effect of ocean acidity yet. There's no good future for coral reefs, no doubt about it. But the implications of coral reefs for the way islands are built are still not clear. And the magnitude of these things and the timing of these things is still not known. Then there's the issue of islands, and islands are certainly the product of a range of processes, including biological productivity on reefs, but they include other things like the way birds use islands. They include issues around vegetation. There's things around currents and so on as well. So the relationship between changing reefs and island forms is very debated. There's a big debate in the science about this. The evidence thus far suggests that very few atoll islands are contracting, but they are changing shape. So you find things like, the place where we always buried our ancestors is now increasingly eroding, and it would appear when you look at this that that's a change in prevailing currents, for example, that's changing the way sediments move around the islands, but the sediment is accumulating elsewhere. One study that's done, and there's a lot of work going on looking at satellite imagery over time, finding that 15.5% of atolls have increased in area over the last 20 years, 11.4% have decreased, but most have remained about the same size. There's some agreement that bigger islands are going to be the larger the island, the more robust they are in response to climate change. They're all going to be harder to live on. They're going to change shape. Reef crests are going to move back towards lagoons. There's going to be more dynamic storm surges and storm events. They're going to be hard to live on, no doubt about that. But they may well still be there. So then the question is, how do we maintain those processes so that islands can continue to respond to climate change? We can continue to have these systems that people can live on, and how can people live on them in a way that maintains a good life? It's very challenging. But we're not talking about sinking islands and forced migration yet. Okay, and then there's what we can do about this, which is a whole other range of uncertainty. This is the biggest dimension of uncertainty about the future of atoll islands, which is what humans might do to adapt. So this is a definition of adaptation. It's adjustment in systems to avoid or reduce the risks of climate change or to capitalise on new opportunities, which actually is important, but I won't go into it. Because we've been so invested in saying how bad climate change is for atolls, because researchers want to publish papers that get cited by saying it's really bad, because we've been understanding the science of climate change impacts so much that we haven't been studying the science of solutions, and because whenever researchers go to talk about adaptation, all they do want to talk about is migration, we don't know what adaptation could achieve in atolls yet. We haven't even tried. So now we conclude, because we don't have ideas about adaptation, there's no future for adaptation, which is a really particularly colonising move. We've stopped the conversation. The only conversation we have is how you can't have a future. I conclude from that, having never tried to effect adaptation, that there is no possibility for adaptation. Once again, we're committed to the negative outcome. So let's talk about what adaptation could achieve. It helps to think a bit about rural versus urban islands, and this is important. This is Ebi, the urban island. The rural island there is Newtown and Tuvalu, just for example, so you can see the difference. Atoll ecosystems are not all the same. Atoll social systems vary a lot. It's important, and there's a paper coming out by Sebastian Stiebel and others who find that 80% of the islands in the world that are inhabited contain only 12% of the population living on atolls, and that there are only 34 atolls contain 87% of the population, which is to say, like everywhere else in the world, there's a massive urban growth issue in atolls, and most rural islands are depopulating and have smaller populations. So, all these countries, Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, are beginning to say, well, we should at least fortify and reclaim our urban areas because that's where most of the population is. That's how we sustain that's how we sustain our sovereignty, and that's how we sustain our countries. Rightly so, and if you're a government and you're a government minister living in an urban island, you of course are going to protect your own environment, and that's where all the investment is going into. That is a massive challenge. The Maldives does this better than most countries, but even there, we can talk about this later, there are issues with the way the Maldives does this. The challenge really isn't so much reclaiming the land, the challenge is building and developing that land with infrastructure, with buildings, with landscaping to make it resilient to climate change and good places to live. That's where all the cost is actually. You can dredge a reef and pump sand onto an island. That's not really very hard actually, nor is it particularly expensive. The cost is everything you do after that. But that means we're neglecting rural islands. And that's an issue too. So when and I'm going to talk a bit about human rights in a minute, when we talk about the human rights of people living on islands, we tend to think about that in terms of national populations. But everybody living on an island has a right to live on the island they belong to, and that includes people on rural islands. So it's useful to think about adaptation in terms of rural and urban islands, and I'm saying we don't think enough about the rural ones. It's important too in terms of the adaptation options. So islands are dynamic processes, as I've tried to explain. They're biological systems where material is deposited on islands that people live on. In rural islands, most ecosystems, because they have low population densities and low development, most ecosystems are pretty intact. So where we see these dynamic island responses and where we see islands responding, they are mostly in those rural islands where ecosystems are doing what they're doing in response to changing environmental conditions. In urban islands, and this is Ebi, which is a pretty extreme example of a highly degraded, not very nice urban environment in the Pacific, ecosystems are not dynamically responding to climate change. They're all dead. Those reefs are gone. You don't want to eat the fish anywhere within a very long way from Ebi. There is no environmental response that you can work with to adapt to climate change in Ebi. You're building a new island here. So the adaptation options for urban and rural areas become quite different. So it helps to keep that in mind. So what can we do? Well, in rural islands in particular, we can change human activities to increase the resilience of atoll ecosystems. And so we know that humans are having all sorts of impacts on, particularly on coral reefs, through solid and liquid waste. So waste disposal is a real problem in atolls. As soon as you have motor vehicles and you have oil and you have wasting out sumps and you have fuel and you have diesel, as soon as you have airplanes, human waste disposal is a problem, disposing of solid waste is a problem. Those things get into the water, they leach into the reefs and they damage the reefs, therefore the reefs are more likely to bleach and you begin to get these kinds of problems. Coastal structures are typically not very well built on atolls. Causeways are being built, ad hoc seawalls are being built, and that is interfering with sediment transfer processes along reefs. Fishing tends to be, for all sorts of reasons I won't go into, heavily degrading certain parts of atoll environments. There's mining of reefs for aggregates, there's clearing of mangroves and seagrasses. So there's all these things that humans are doing as a process of development that are interfering with the ecological resilience of islands. So addressing those things through diverse forms of pretty mundane natural resource management and technology problems can make a big difference. You can restore degraded ecosystems as well by putting mangroves back and trying to replant seagrasses and so on. So this is very important. This is called ecosystem-based adaptation. It's not very exciting. Not much of adaptation is very exciting. The point is you do all the things that you need to do. And then there's the way people live on these islands. So one of the interesting things that we picked up in the Marshall Islands was with colonisation, and particularly with the advent of the church in the Pacific, people were all moved onto coastal areas. And often people's villages were not in coastal areas for all sorts of reasons, partly because coasts are dynamic environments and not necessarily safe places to live. There's all sorts of archaeological evidence of people living in the middle, even of fairly narrow atoll islands, because they're in the middle and they're not near coastlines which are changing and they're relatively free from flooding and so on. So this creates interesting issues about where assets are located. In the lifetime of asset cycles that we're talking about in atolls, there is continuous investment. People are still building houses, people are still building schools, they're building runways and all these kinds of things. And so the location of these things needs to be thought about very carefully. The point of this picture is to say, if you were living on an island that's dynamically changing like this, you wouldn't build something there anymore. You would build something here. Right, and with evidence and with geomorphological evidence and with paleoarchaeological evidence, we can understand the way islands have responded in the past and understand the way they're going to respond in the future and think about where are more or less safe places to situate things in islands. So that's very important. The other thing is about the way we build things. And so it's an astonishing thing from an economic point of view to think that the biggest investment very low income people in atolls will make will be in their house. And they will import building materials from a very long way away, concrete, timber, steel, and build concrete houses made out of Besser blocks that are too hot on the beach. And that's the biggest investment they'll make in their life, which under a changing climate is a really bad investment. So the way houses are built, the way water systems are built, the way sewage systems are built, the way telecommunications and electricity systems are built, the way transport infrastructure is built could all be done differently and be more modular and flexible in response to changing environmental conditions, which is the way people used to build. And so there's a really interesting conversation going on about now how can we take modern kind of building and engineering, house engineering technologies and water technologies and try to kind of leverage off traditional understandings about the way infrastructure would be built to completely change the way people live in these environments that make them more resilient to a more dynamic environment. And there's an awful lot that can be done here. And there's no shortage of case studies of people living in really highly flood-prone environments across Asia and in some parts of the Pacific and Papua New Guinea, where people are quite happy to live on elevated houses above water because they'd rather do that and live there than move from the places to which they belong and to which they have livelihoods and to which their families belong. So people's tolerance of environmental change varies, it grows over time, and technology can assist them to live in those changing environments. The way economies are structured and the way people live and the way they procure their food can also be worked with. And so there is in atolls an extreme example of the problems of poverty and disadvantage that come from remoteness and a lack of access to markets and infrastructure and so on. Extreme examples of this, we did some work in the Marshall Islands where it was a big survey of the population and a group went out to Enewetak, which is, if you know anything about the Marshall Islands, the US nuclear testing, there's a big concrete dome there in Enewetak where they dumped 40,000 cubic metres of radioactive waste, including radioactive waste shipped from Nevada to the Marshall Islands. It's under a concrete dome, but there's nothing underneath it. It sits on the water table in an atoll environment. So people there are very worried about drinking the groundwater. People are very worried about eating food from the food chain environment. They had a reverse osmosis unit that was producing plenty of water. The reverse osmosis unit broke. There's a $100 part to fix the reverse osmosis unit, but $60,000 to charter the plane to take the $100 part to Enewetak. So people are drinking groundwater. So you can do an awful lot by simply investing in rural resilience, improving transport, improving ICT, changing the way people procure water, changing the way people grow food, diversifying livelihoods through connectivity, human capital formation, rural banking, small grants, microfinance, all the things we know have worked to improve livelihood resilience and reduce people's vulnerability to climate change in other disadvantaged parts of the world. Just wave of technology sweeping through places like Bangladesh that are not being applied in the Pacific, but could be applied in the Pacific in rural areas. These are just investment and technology problems. They're not even complicated ones. Just need to try. And then there's working with these environments in all sorts of ways. And so there's a lot of fervour around nature-based solutions, and the Oceans Institute here is very good at these things to restore vegetation that's been lost, to use targeted interventions to protect hotspots and sites at risk through mangroves and seagrass, littoral vegetation, artificial beaches, artificial reefs and sandbars, modification of reef crests. There's a lot of things you can do in atolls. They're actually quite malleable environments. And our panel members can talk much more about this than I can, but there's a lot of experimentation going on now. It's very promising. And there are other things that you can do, nature-based solutions and other more engineering-type options to protect hotspots. These are pictures from Nanumea and Nanumanga in Tuvalu. The thing that I want to point out to you here is that when the people in Nanumea were asked, you know, what do you want to protect from climate change? They said, we protect the church. Which I could go into this, the importance of the church and people in Tuvalu, but they're protecting the church with these kind of structures. And so these things can be done to protect critical assets that are super important to people, and they're quite likely to work for a very long time. And then we get into the urban areas in particular, which can be engineered. These are all pictures from the Maldives. I don't know if you've been to the Maldives, anybody. This and this is Huhumali. Huhumali is an entirely reclaimed island, being highly developed. Well, I won't go into the issues of Huhumali, but to say it can be done. It takes a lot of money, takes a lot of engineering, but you can do it. And the Maldives is engineering its way out of climate change, or thinks it is anyway, and if you had Dutch engineering and Scandinavian regulation, I'm sure it can work. Put that way. Okay, finally, let's talk about the people. So there's things we can do, right? A big part of the story about this and about why atolls have no futures is a kind of cultural misunderstanding and, frankly, a little bit of racism and misunderstanding. So people say they lack the capacity. Capacity is an extremely big word that contains an awful lot of things underneath it to implement adaptation policies and programs. If they can't help themselves, then donors have to do that to them because we have the capacity, we've got the money, we've got the engineering, we've got the smarts, and we know how to do that. And the more donors do that, then of course the less opportunity there is for people to demonstrate what they can do, the less we pay attention, and so on, and round and round it goes. So here's the thing that's worth thinking about. I'll just talk about the Marshall Islands because it's the place I've been working in a lot mostly. So people navigated their way to the Marshall Islands 3,000 years ago. They found a bunch of low-lying sandy islands with a bit of vegetation with no surface water and nothing on them. And they've been living there for 3,000 years. They lived there through the Second World War. They lived there through various small changes in climate over those 3,000 years. They lived there through 67 nuclear tests, the equivalent of 1.9 Hiroshima bombs every day for 10 years, and they're still there. So who's to say, and I'm telling you now, if you get stranded on an atoll with a consultant from the Asian Development Bank and there's a bunch of Marshallese over there, I'll tell you who you want to talk to and live with for the next year. Guaranteed. So the challenge is much less to do with what goes on in atoll people and much more to do with the way the international system interacts with them and with their systems and the financial support, which brings with a range of controls that frankly impede change more than they enable change. There is an industry that exists to save atolls, and it doesn't exist if atolls can save themselves. So it needs to say that they need help, otherwise they're all out of work. And so the way they engage is very poor. It leads to a great deal of stigmatisation and a great deal of frustration. It was never true that people in atolls couldn't adapt. They are in fact highly malleable environments, and you only need to start asking people and looking at maps and looking at things going on in the environment to see that people have been managing these environments for an extremely long time. Yes, they're built by natural forces, but they're also built by humans in a really interesting kind of combination of symbolic, cultural and material things that come together. There are creation stories and genealogies and land tenure allocations. There are sacred sites and totems that lead to some places being protected and some people being utilised. There are complex conservation regimes going on in atolls that are using the whole islands and all the different islands in them. There are uses of trees to stabilise shores, to prevent and conserve fresh water, to replenish soils. The whole business of growing palaka, for example, is an incredible thing. The main land crop in Tuvalu is a swamp taro that takes 7 to 10 years to harvest. So people have built these civilisations, mulching stuff they're growing from the thing, mulching those soils, digging down into the water table to grow this crop that they harvest on a 7 to 10 year rotational cycle. It's an amazing thing. Gardening to change soils and topography and species mix, building a fish pond, species transplantation, digging channels through reefs, building clam beds, all these things people have been doing for thousands of years to maintain their environments and to live on them. A lot of stuff that can be worked with here, particularly if we then apply modern technology and science to work with that, and I think there is a role for that. Adult countries have some real policy capacity advantages. They have very small populations. It means leaders are proximate and accountable. You go to the supermarket in the Marshall Islands or in Tuvalu, you're standing next to a minister or the minister's wife. You can't be a bad politician and hide from your population. There is no anonymity. Everybody knows anything. You are immediately accountable to your population. That's important, and that leads to some pretty good forms of governance. We don't see it, but it does. Politics is dynamic and responsive. Bureaucracies can be very rapid and responsive, but they're very small, and so much of what the issue of capacity is here is actually a lack of investment in the people to do the work. Also coupled with the fact that, you know, flights go once or twice a week, and so when the people are always reporting and keeping up with donors and going to UN events, they're always travelling. So there just isn't enough people. Look at the list of delegations to the UNFCCC things, you'll see Australia takes 150, 200 people. Some countries in the Pacific will take 2 or 3 people. That's their climate change team. Very strong consensus-based decision-making process, so actually very little conflict around these things, at least open conflict. Conflicts just get deferred until consensus are reached at. And a very high awareness of climate change. COVID-19 was a very interesting natural experiment. There was a Global Health Security Index prior to COVID-19 that ranked countries in the world according to their vulnerability to pandemics. Very much like the climate change vulnerability indexes, where we rank places according to their vulnerability. And at the bottom, the most vulnerable countries were Tuvalu, Kiribati and the Marshall Islands. They were in the 3 of the 7 or 8 most vulnerable countries to a pandemic. COVID comes along. The 3 countries with the lowest total number of cases in the world were Tuvalu, Kiribati and the Marshall Islands. And you sit back and you go, well, obviously, right, you know, they're remote and they're distant and they're able to close their borders and they're able to do all sorts of things. And in retrospect, you go, oh yeah, well, the index was wrong. Well, I'm suggesting to you that maybe in retrospect, the index about the vulnerability of atolls might also be wrong. We might look at this in 20 to 30 years' time and go, geez, we really had that wrong, didn't we? There were things that could be done. Why in terms of COVID? They recognised the problem and they acted early. Same with climate change. Vulnerability is the potential for risk, not the realisation of it. There's a lot of lessons to be learned about how institutions dealt with risk in this situation. Strong mandate for action of the public. People were really, really scared of climate change. They're insisting that their governments acted, whereas we were like, oh, yeah, no, we don't really trust our government. We think it's a hoax. So governments were pushed by their populations to close their borders. They leveraged global and regional support really effectively. They were able to disperse their populations in quite interesting ways, so they embraced their remoteness. They have minimal economic impact because actually they weren't really well connected to the global economy anyway. So they really actually use their geography to their advantage. You say, well, geography is the problem of climate change. Well, geography was supposed to be the problem for COVID too. So I'm not saying there's a perfect parallel between COVID and climate change, but I'm saying it was a very interesting natural experiment where we learned that atoll countries are actually really pretty bloody capable of managing an emergency. The other thing that's really interesting is, you know, and I'm saying this to people all the time, listen to what they say. You listen to what the leaders of these countries are saying, you'll be surprised. So here's just an excerpt that I quite like from the Marshall Islands adaptation communication. You can read it yourself. And so if climate change didn't happen, you would never have heard of Tuvalu. Tuvalu has 10,000 people. I do this thing in my lecture where I compare the economy and the population of Tuvalu to my school in my university, and it turns out my school in my university has a budget about the same size as the population of Tuvalu. You would never have heard about it because of climate change, but you know about Tuvalu because of their advocacy around climate change. Because they've had excellent ambassadors, very strong leadership, because they work in the UN system with other small island states, they leverage their position as a member of the UN system, and they act collectively through things like the UN Security Council. The atoll countries themselves work together through a group called the Coalition of Low-Lying Atoll Nations on Climate Change, and the atoll countries have been at the forefront of the recent changes in human rights law that have become very, very important. And so this recent decision by the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on the obligation of states with respect to climate change determined that 1.5 temperature target is legally binding under the Paris Agreement, that ambitious action is required, and that all states are responsible to protect the human rights of people in small island states. Now, my initial response to the ICJ decision was, that's symbolically very useful, international law doesn't make a difference, whatever. But human rights law does matter, actually, and sometimes human rights law does matter, and human rights law matters in this country. When the Torres Strait Islands took the Australian government to the Human Rights Council and got a recognition that Australia's admissions and failure to adapt, to assist the Torres Strait Islands to adapt, was a violation of human rights, the Commonwealth government came in and suddenly became very interested in adaptation in the Torres Strait. So we're going to start seeing, I think, much stronger moral arguments around climate change because of the ICJ decision. It means adaptation isn't a voluntary and aspirational thing as it is under the UN Climate Change Convention. It's in fact a legally binding thing under the Human Rights Conventions. And that, I think, will enable a lot of change. And they did that. They changed international law. So don't discount the capability of people living on atolls. Two conclusions. There's plenty that can be done so that people can continue to live good lives in dynamic atoll environments. There's hope, but it's a pretty narrow window. The challenges are large. This is a moonshot kind of thing. The stuff that I talked about around adaptation, it's not one of those things, it's all of those things. And it's all of those things for decades and decades and decades, plus all the stuff, the emerging technologies that we can see on the horizon that we could bring into those things. The better housing systems, the wave energy generators that Christoph and the Oceans Institute are developing, all sorts of things, all of it, all at once. A moonshot. The question is, who's going to take responsibility for that moonshot? How are we going to organise that? Who's going to lead that? Where is that going to happen? Could that happen here? Australia has low-lying islands. We have the Torres Strait. We have Cocos Keeling, Tiwi Islands, Christmas Island. What's our role here? Interesting question to ask. And if, through an adaptation moonshot like this, we could show that adaptation is possible in atolls, well then adaptation is possible everywhere. If we can provide a hopeful future for atolls, then we should all take hope about the future from climate change. And that's my final point, really, that we need to be thinking about hope as an enabler of adaptation. I will say to you, hope is a choice. You can embrace it or not. It takes work. You can choose to focus on the problems and how hard it's all going to be and the reason why it's all difficult, or you can choose to focus on solutions, respect the agencies of people, think about the enablers of change. It takes evidence, it takes practice, it takes a bit of courage. I'll stop there. Thanks.